Everybody. This is a seminar of the Harvard China Project on Energy, Economy, and Environment, which is based in the Harvard Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. My name is Chris Nielsen. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to repeat the usual sort of logistical things. We like to hold these seminars as close as possible to an in-person seminar, which means mostly that you will have a chance to ask questions directly to the speaker at the end. But that means that your microphones are actually live and you need to mute them until we get to the Q&A period. Make sure you mute them or we're going to mute them for you. When we get to the Q&A period, you need to raise your hand. That will be an option. I think it depends on your Zoom version, but it may be under reactions or it may be under participants, I think. And that we're recording this seminar. We're gonna put it on our website and maybe distribute it in other ways. So our speaker today, again, we're leaning on one of our friends and colleagues to give a talk from China, which means it's very late at night for him. So be sympathetic if he gets a little sleepy-eyed during your question or something. Teng Fei is Associate Professor and Deputy Director of the Institute of Energy, Environment, and Economy at Tsinghua University. His research interests include energy and climate policy analysis using modeling tools and how this all fits into the international climate regime, which he's very much focused on. His degrees are from Tsinghua, bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and applied math, and then his master's and PhD in management science in the School of Public Policy and Management, and he did his postdoctoral research in France. So the one thing I want to mention, which I don't think is in the bio that we distributed about him, that is very important to understand him, is that he he is very, very involved in the processes to provide scientific and kind of research advice to a lot of different policy processes in China and internationally. So I'm just going to read a few of these things so you get a sense of it. I'm not going to necessarily list them all, but he's been involved in research supporting the 2050 low emission development strategy of China. He's been a lead author in the IPCC 5th and 6th assessment report in Working Group 3. He's been a lead author of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Chinese National Assessment Report on Climate Change. Drafting team for the National Plan on Climate Change. He was on the advisory experts to China's negotiating team in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 2007 to 2017. He was the chief negotiator for transparency in the Chinese delegation. I believe that's to the UNFCCC from the year 2009 to 2016. And, you know, there's more of these things. He's this one last one I'll mention. He's been a member of the advisory experts for second track dialogue between China and India, China and the EU, China and the UK, and China and the US. So he is deeply, deeply familiar with all of the international diplomatic and policy efforts related to climate change, in addition to his research that he does on his own. So with that, Professor Teng Fei.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Chris, for this very kind introduction. So firstly, I will share my screen. And I hope everyone can see my screen. Is it okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. My topic today is re-estimating the stranded assets of coal power sector in China. Is it too big to fail? This is an ongoing paper that I'm preparing with two of my students. One is my PhD, Deng Xu, and another is my graduated master, Qian Fangyuan. So I would generally start from the motivation and talk about the method of our study and some result we get from this study and the conclusion we have based on our result and some of the policy implication and also the discussions. Firstly, the motivation that I think it is well known that to achieve this 1.5 degree pathway requires immediate stop of the new investment in coal. And also we need to quickly phase out the existing coal power plants, not only in China, but also almost in all over the world. That is generally the message from the IPCC study and various other studies. And if you look at the China's pathway, I think that several weeks ago, Professor Li Zheng from Tsinghua also presented this 2060 low carbon development strategy study from Tsinghua University. Generally, that study shows a very substantial reduction of the coal capacity from now on towards 2050. Generally, for year 2020, the coal power capacity in China is generally about 1,100 gigawatts. To achieve 1.5 degree, which requires that coal capacity without CCS to be reduced from 1,100 gigawatts in 2020 to around 35 gigawatts in 2050. So generally almost 97% reduction of the coal capacity. And also, but if you look at what this means for China's coal power sector, this is a figure to compare the age structure of China's coal power plants, which shows generally that compared with US, the Chinese power plant is, has a lower age. Generally, that the average age of coal power plant in China is only about 11 years, compared with the US, which is larger than 40 years. So that means to phase out coal power plant, China face much larger challenge compared with US, because of most of the Chinese power plant are very much younger in terms of their age structure. That also might be the case for India in the future. But what this coal phase out means for China in terms of its impact on the coal power sectors. The early phase out of those coal power plants means there will be a large amount of devaluation of those investments because of they need to phase out before their physical lifetime. Generally, that is 30 years in China's context. Therefore, that means the so-called stranded assets, because of those assets will not be able to allow to work till the end of their physical time. But the literatures disagree each other on the scale of those stranded assets in China's coal power sector. I think that there are several studies have tried to estimate the level of those stranded assets in China's coal power sector, which generally we present in the left panel of these slides. You can see generally the uncertainty range is very large, from $100 billion to more than $400 billion. And if you look at those median of those estimates, the median is about $260 billion. So the upper level is 400 billion and the median is about $260 billion for the stranded assets in Chinese coal power sector. But what these numbers means from a policymakers' perspective, I need to see that those numbers will be scary for them. If we bear in mind that compared with China's GDP in 2020, the 260 to 400 billion dollars will means around 2% to 3% of China's yearly GDP in 2020. Or if you compare that numbers with the overall market value for top 30 listed power company in China, that numbers will be 1 or 2 times higher than the total market value for top listed power company in China, which altogether is about $200 billion. So that means if those numbers are real, that means the carbon neutrality target of 1.5 degree target will make China lost all of its market value for top listed power company. Or if you consider that this risk for financial system in China, those numbers will increase non-performing loan of Chinese bank by 50%. So that generally what those numbers means from a financial perspective. So based on those numbers, my question is, do you believe that a serious policymaker in China will decide to phase out coal if they believe those numbers is true? Frankly, I don't think so because of if those numbers are true, then to phase out coal so quickly means that will impose significant financial risk on China's banking system and financial system. So whether or not China's coal power sector is too big to fail, our answer is not, because of we believe that which is very much depends on how we define stranded assets. There are various concepts for stranded assets from various perspectives for policymakers, for owners, for the banks. So from the literatures, the definition on stranded assets is quite different. It depends on from which stakeholders' perspective to define these stranded assets. But among many of those different concepts, we believe that 2 of them are very important. The first one, we call it stranded value, which is generally a reduction in the future revenue generated by an asset due to the introduction of climate policy or energy policy, whatever. Which generally means, for example, if we have a power plant and those power plant will generate a cash flow in the future, but if you have a climate policy intervention at some time, then this policy will change your future cash flow. If you are a coal-fired power plant, then a carbon tax or whatever emission trading may reduce your competitiveness and reduce your future cash flow. Then those reduction of your future cash flow need to be considered and need to be added or discounted to the base year, and those discounted reduction of the future revenue is the stranded value. So that is a devaluation of your assets. That is the stranded value definition. But compared with the stranded value definition, which focus very much focus on the cash flow, we have another definition which focus on the uncovered investment. We call it stranded capital. So if we consider this stranded capital definition, which generally defined as the uncovered capital by an assets due to the introduction of the climate policy. For example, that in the upper part of these figures, you have initial investment for your power plant in the first year, And then once you operate this power plant, it will generate money, and part of those money will be used to cover your initial investment. But if at some time there is a new climate policy came in, and then at the end of your power plant, you have some amount of those capital will not be able to cover, then those uncovered part of the capital will be defined as the stranded capital. So you can see the difference between those two concepts, which is very much focused on the cash flow, and another very much focused on the capital or the investment. And those difference might be significant between these two uh, definition on the stranded assets. And most of the previous study generally use the stranded value perspective instead of the stranded capital perspective. Uh, but we believe that a stranded capital perspective is more policy relevant for China because of the following reasons. Firstly, um, most of the coal power plant in China, uh, they are owned by the national or local government, which is quite different with other countries. For example, in US, a majority of those coal power plant is owned by private company instead of state-owned company. What this means, that means that while it is it for the state-owned company, that will be not fair that to use the stranded value to define the devaluation of those state-owned assets, because that is basically the money transfer from one pocket to another. And the stranded value definition may overestimate those lost of the assets value from the stranded assets perspective. And the second reason for the stranded capital perspective is generally in China, the policymakers much more concerns about the impact on power sector, debt financing, and also the banking system. So they will more concerned about how many of those capital will not be able to cover in the future because of this introduction of carbon neutrality target, instead of how many value will be lost or how many of profit will be lost. So from that perspective, the stranded capital is more relevant or more policy relevant. And the third reason for that, generally, even some of those power company in China, even they are state-owned power company in China, they are also listed in the stock market. But most of the stock market, I mean, the Chinese stock market generally give a nearly one price to book ratio, the so-called PB ratio, to the power generation company in the market. The PB ratio is generally the market price ratio. I mean, the ratio between the market price and the book assets. So the one PB ratio is generally, even in the stock market, the stakeholders consider the capital is a much better indicator to value the assets of power generation company in China. So based on those three reasons, we use a stranded capital perspective to estimate the stranded assets instead of using the stranded value perspective, which has been used by previous study. Our research question is generally as follows. Three of them are the most interested research policy for us. The first one is, what is the more accurate, or maybe not accurate, but policy relevant estimate of stranded assets for coal power sector in China? Is it so big as previous estimates, or there is a significant overestimate for these stranded assets? And second question is how future investment policy for coal power sector affects stranded assets, because of most of the previous study only focus on the estimates for the existing power plants, but didn't give us a sense that what is the stranded assets, which might be incurred by the future investment policy. For example, if China continue to investment in coal, what this means in terms of the growth of those stranded assets in the future. And the third question we are asking is, if we stop investment in coal power plant right now, or in next 5 years, or after 2025, whether or not there will be enough power supply for Chinese electricity consumption. Because of there's concern on this from the local government that if we stop coal power investment right now, so is there any possibility that to have a power shortage in the next 5 or 10 years or before 2050? So this security concern, how to address that. So that is 3 questions we are asking in this study. And the method we are using is generally, firstly, to answer the first question, we built a data site for the plant level Chinese coal power plant. But different with previous study, we add an ownership structure to this plant level database so that we can identify the ownership of those coal-fired power plant in China. We can identify whether or not they belong to a state-owned company or local government-owned company or private company. And that will allow us to consider the impact of the stranded capital and the stranded assets and the stranded value definitions. And the second part of our methodology, generally, we develop a set of scenarios to consider how the investment policy in the future will impact the stranded assets in coal power sector in China. We consider that if we follow this carbon neutrality pathway towards 2050, then if we stop the new investment from 2020, 2025, or 2030, what this means for the estimates of stranded assets for existing power plant and for new installed coal-fired power plant in the future. So that is generally the second part of our methodology on the scenario design. And for the third part, we generally consider firstly that what is the impact of the coal generation hour under this carbon neutrality target pathway, whether or not is there any possibility of the safety issues or the possibilities that to, I mean, the lack of the power supply in China's electricity system in the future if you stop the investment of the coal power sectors. And that is generally that the data side we used for this study. We merged the data from 4 major plant level database from Global Coal Plant Tracker, from the official power industry statistics, from the database from the coal consumption cap project, and also the global data, which is generally a business company data. So we merged those 4 databases and we clean those 4 databases to form a more comprehensive plant level coal-fired power plant database with ownership structures. And with database, we have generally about 3,300 units from Chinese coal power plants with capacity more than 1,200 gigawatts, which includes about 1,000 gigawatts of existing capacity and another 220 gigawatts for planned or permitting capacity, which is going to be installed after 2018. And the methodology we use to estimate the stranded assets is based on the two definitions we have discussed. One is on the stranded value, another is on the stranded capital. The stranded value is generally the difference of the two cash flow with or without the carbon neutrality. And the stranded capital is generally the difference in the capital uncovered. Because of time limitation, I will not discuss the detail of those two methodology, but you can understand how they are different each other. And the scenarios generally, as we have said, we consider those scenarios. The baseline scenario is generally if we continue the trends of investment in coal-fired power plant until 2050, we call it CPS scenarios. And another three scenarios generally to consider if we follow the carbon neutrality scenario for the electricity demand, but we consider the different capacity installations scenarios. The first one is we continue to build the coal power plant till 2050. The second one is we consider to stop the new coal power plant after 2030 or after 2025 or after 2020. So we will use scenarios to study that how those future investment decisions may affect the estimates of stranded assets in China's coal power sector. And here we present some of those results. Firstly is on the structure of the age and ownership. The right figure shows the ownership and the age structure of Chinese existing power plant. You can see that generally the average age of Chinese coal-fired power plant is 11.3 years old. It's quite young compared with others. And more than 70% of those power plants was built after 2005. And that is why to phase out coal is very much challenging for China because they are too young. In terms of the ownership structure, you can see that a majority part of that power plants belong to state-owned companies. Generally, about 67% of those installed capacity belong to the 6 largest Chinese state-owned companies. And there are also 20% of those power capacities belong to local government, which means the state government at provincial or city level. And there are only about 13% of capacity belong to private company, which could be joint venture, or which could be foreign company or private company in China. So that is the age and ownership structure from the database. And if you look at our estimate of the stranded capital, you can see that we estimate a much lower stranded capital compared with previous study. In the left part of this figure, those arrow bars show the range of the previous study. And you can see that the range generally from $100 billion to $400 billion estimates for the stranded assets in Chinese power sector. But our estimates for the stranded capital definition is only 45 billion USD dollars, which is only generally 1/10 of the upper level of previous estimates, or 1/6 of the median of the previous study. And our estimates of the stranded value is also lower than the previous study. The previous study estimates a range from 200 to about 400 of stranded value estimates, but our estimates only have are only around 70 billion USD dollars for stranded value. I will briefly explain why our estimates is much lower than the previous study. The first one, of course, is we use stranded capital definition instead of a stranded value definition. We have explained those regions, and we believe this definition is much more policy relevant for China's context. And the previous study didn't consider this ownership structure and most of them use a stranded value definition. That is the first reason why our estimation is much lower. And second reason is generally because of the previous study. Uh, uh, Most of them use a lower coal price and a higher electricity price. But our estimates use a higher coal price and electricity and a lower electricity price. The reason for that is generally because of most of the previous study has been done around the year 2016, where the coal price is much lower. You can see from this figure that the coal price changed very much in the last decades from the 2010 to 2020. And there is a valley around 2015 to 2016. And most of the estimates for the stranded assets in China's coal power plants happens at that time. But our study generally use a higher coal price and lower electricity price, and which because of the estimates of stranded value is very much sensitive to the coal price. So that is basically why we have a much lower estimates of the stranded assets, because of the profit of the coal-fired power plant will be lower at this moment compared with several years ago. And this also could be considered as a possible conclusion that or recommendation that this high coal price may be considered or provide an opportunity window for coal phase out, because of most of the coal power plant doesn't generate profit right now. So that might be a good reason that to persuade the government to phase out coal at this moment. And the next result generally on how the future investment decision may affect the stranded assets. This figure generally shows the stranded assets under different investment scenarios. The blue bar shows the stranded assets of existing capacity. The pink bar shows the stranded assets of capacity to be invested or to be installed after 2018. So you can see that the future investment decision has huge implication on the stranded assets. If China followed the normal investment pathway, but the electricity demand follow the neutrality, the carbon neutrality pathway, then there will be inconsistency between this investment activity and the power consumption part, and that may create a significant stranded assets in the future. That part of significant that part of stranded assets might be much larger than the stranded assets of existing power plants. But if China can stop the coal power investment right now, for example, for 2020, then a large amount of those future stranded assets can be avoided. As you have shown, as you can see that in the figures on these slides, which can halve, at least half the stranded assets if you didn't stop the coal power investment till 2050. And but another one interesting finding is the time horizon or time point to stop this coal power investment for China. You can see that if you stop the investment for coal power plant in 2020, 2025, or 2030, the impact on the stranded assets um, have some difference, but not very significant. If you delay 1 year of stopping coal investment in China, which may incur the addition of 1.2 billion USD increase of stranded assets. But if you stop coal power plant investment after 2030, then you still have the opportunity to avoid most of those stranded assets. So which shows a very interesting finding that although most of the current policy brief or the current policy recommendation focus on to recommend China to stop coal power plant investment in the next 5 years. But in fact, the most critical time period for China is after 2030, is not the next 5 years during the 14th five-year plan. So why this happens is generally because of we have discussed this age structure of Chinese power plants that the average age of Chinese power plant is about 11 years. So that means most of those Chinese power plants will retire around 2030. So you can see that in the left figure of this slide, there will be a very steep retirement cliff. We call this retirement cliff after 2030 because of a significant part of Chinese coal power plants will retire after 2030. And that is why that if China add the coal power capacity after 2030 to reserve these retirement cliff issues, then those investment after 2030 may create the most part of the concerns on the stranded assets of the coal power plant, but not in the next 5 years, because of whatever in the next five years, China will not add too much coal-fired power plant. That there is a consensus. But after 2030, that might be divergence opinions among experts because of most of those existing coal power plants will retire at that time. And then that creates another concerns, which is if a significant part of those coal power plants retire after 2030, then whether or not after 2030, that the power system, which will be dominated by renewables and non-fossil fuels, can accommodate China's power consumption, whether or not there will be security issues for the power supply. And we also tested this. The result shows in the middle of these figures. You can see that we generally our result shows there will be no power shortage before 2036. But if China failed to achieve this low carbon transition and the coal and the power system still need a lot of generation from the coal power plant, then the shortage may happen after 2036. So that there might be a trade-off between the low carbon transition and the safety of the power supply. But how to resolve this? Whether or not China need to install more coal capacity after 2030, or China has a policy option that to reserve this, to have a win-win solution. Both China can phase out the coal power plant and at the same time still can guarantee the supply of the power generation that will make sure that whole system can provide enough electricity. And there are different policy options which is available for the policymakers, but we consider one single policy, which is to extend the lifetime of the existing power units from 30 years to 40 years. So generally, which shows that could be considered as a win-win solution. The result shows in the right panel of these figures. The upper part of these figures is the estimates of stranded assets if we continue the exercise that of the 30 years lifetime for the power plant in China. And the lower part of this figure shows if we could extend the lifetime of power plant in China from 30 years to 40 years, what is the impact on the estimates of stranded assets? You can show that for the stranded capital, this lifetime extension from 30 years to 40 years will substantially reduce the stranded capital. The reason for that is generally given the extension of lifetime for the coal-fired power plant in China, you can avoid a large part of the new investment because of without this lifetime extension, you need to install new capacity to meet the power demand. But if you could extend the existing power plant, then you can avoid those new investments. And this life extension could be considered as a possible solution in the future that to achieve a win-win solution. On one hand, it can guarantee that the possibility of the power shortage will be reduced. And on another hand, the stranded assets problem can be largely resolved by this life extension. And of course, there could be other policy options, for example, that to retrofit those power plants to provide flexibility service or to provide ancillary service for the electricity system in China. That could be other possible solutions. But in this study, we only focus on the option of the life extension. So generally, that is the studies. We estimate the stranded assets by using the definition of the stranded capital, which is different with previous study, which very much based on the definition of stranded value. And we estimate a much lower stranded assets compared with previous study by a factor of 6 to 9. And this is important because of that means the stranded assets problem in China is not too big to fail. The numbers of 40 to 50 billion dollars is something we believe that the policymaker in China can accommodate and can identify policy solution to reserve it, which is quite different with the previous scary numbers, which may make the policymakers in a difficult position to pursue carbon neutrality pathway. And also, we explained why our estimate is much lower than previous study, which generally based on because of this difference between stranded asset, stranded capital and stranded value, and also because of the lower coal price and higher the higher coal price and lower electricity price we use, which reflects the current situation. And also, we think that not only the stranded assets for existing capacity is important, but also the stranded assets heavily depends on the investment decision in the future. If China can stop coal investment right now, then it can avoid about 2/3 of the total stranded assets in the future. And if China can, and another finding is, although most of the policy analysis focus on the decision in the 14th five-year plan, we point out that the investment decision after 2030 and 2035 is even more important for China to avoid this total stranded assets because of the retirement cliff and because of most of the existing capacity will be retired at that time. And so we think that the extension of the lifetime of existing capacity could be considered as interesting policy options for Chinese policymakers to achieve trade-off, achieve a win-win solution between the safety of the power supply and also the reserve of the stranded assets in coal power sector in China. And the implication is generally as follows. We think that the stranded assets should not be a concern for Chinese policymakers because that numbers is not so big as estimated in the previous study. And China need to consider the policy options to stop the coal power investment in 14th five-year plan. And as you may know that in the climate leader summit, the presidency also announced that China will control the coal power capacity. That will be a very good signal from China that to move towards that direction. And third is we illustrate the importance of the time horizon from 2030 to 2035 because of most of existing coal power plants need to be retired at that time. And China's power system will face a very steep retirement of coal power plants in that time. So how the power system in China can accommodate such a steep retirement cliff after 2030 is still an open question. If China can deal with this, then probably will can achieve this carbon neutrality target in electric sector. But if China's system cannot accommodate this retirement cliff after 2030, then that might be a concern for the emission pathway from electric sector in China. And of course, we do highlight some limitations of our studies. Firstly, we didn't consider the impact of future electricity market reform that may have impacts on our estimates. And also, our study is very much dependent on the electricity and the coal price, which is quite different with previous studies. But how this sensitivity can change the attitude of policymakers is still an open issue. And last but not least one is we didn't incorporate power dispatch model in our study. So the study on the safety and the power supply issues very much based on average estimation of generation hour. The more detailed model to incorporate the power dispatch model may provide further insights for the estimates of the stranded assets in the future. So I just stop here. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Very interesting. That's a different perspective on these issues than we tend to read about. Okay, so questions. I have a question, but I want to give other people a chance to go first. Mike?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for an amazingly comprehensive talk. Very educational. Also, I think implications for the kind of study that needs to be done for the United States as well as for China. So congratulations on that. I had a couple of questions. One is, in doing the study, you are making, presumably implicitly, some assumptions about the future demand for electricity. And if I consider the possibility that the future demand is going to be much higher than we currently anticipate due to, for example, building out a reliance on hydrogen as part of the system and so on and so forth, if the future demand is much larger, what does that actually do to these estimates of stranded assets? And the second question I had in mind is that have you considered doing a comparable study on the transmission system and the investments and the stranded assets that might be involved with the transmission system? So again, thank you so much for a great talk.
Thank you, but Chris, I will respond one by one, or just collect the several questions and respond together.
One by one.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you, Mac, for your question. Firstly, on the transmission question, we didn't consider the stranded assets for the transmission system. We only focus on the generation part, and especially on the coal power generation. So we didn't include the estimates of the transmission, the stranded assets of the transmission system in our study. And second, on the implication of future power demand, I agree that the future power demand might be larger than the scenarios. Our power demand scenarios is very much based on the ICCSD study. So I didn't remember the exact number, but the power demand under a 1.5 scenario will be larger than the current policy scenarios. So they have taken into consideration of the electrification in the future that may lead to a much higher electricity demand. But if in the future, the electricity demand is even larger than that, I believe that will have the implication on our estimation of the safety issues. I mean, whether or not the future power system can supply enough electricity for China. Our current study shows that if China failed to achieve that low carbon transition, then the 2036 might be the time point that the safety concerns happens. But if there will be a larger power demand, then the time point might be earlier than that time. Whatever, we still have at least 15 years buffer to stop this coal power plant, and you can assess this after at least 10 years after 2030.
Thank you.
I actually want to, am I unmuted? I can't even tell. Okay. Yeah, I want to actually ask my question then, because it's something of a follow-up to Mike's. I want to understand more about the kind of assumptions that go into the analysis about security in the out years. You emphasize so much about how 2/3 of the total stranded assets could be avoided if you just stop building coal-fired power plants, and that seems, to non-experts, it seems like an obvious solution or an obvious thing to do, and particularly because a lot of these plants are non-performing basically. And if I understand correctly, your analysis essentially is suggesting that they may need to be built for power security reasons, but that is a really, really complicated issue that has a lot of different factors in it. This actually gets to the question that I asked in the workshop we were doing on Monday about the capacity, the modeling capacity to actually unpack, what those, how you're going to balance the intermittency of renewables and so forth. I mean, a lot of people would just say you can build a lot of renewables instead of this non-performing coal power plants, and there are a variety of strategies that allow you to compensate for the variability, whether it's grid integration across space, whether it's power, whether it's power storage strategies, whether it's pumped hydro. There's, there's just so many different things. And to me, there's just a lot of uncertainties. And when you're talking about 2036 or 2030, it's really, it's kind of, it's too soon to really be able to judge that you're not going to be able to provide that power security with a very, very different capacity, renewable dominated capacity mix.
Yeah, I think that our estimates based on the inconsistency between the investment and the power demand. I mean, if the investor, right now, those investment decisions are generally approved by local government instead of the central government in China. And that may create some inconsistency in terms of expectation for the future. If the local government believe that the future electricity system or power system still require a significant part of coal generation, then they have the incentives to invest in more coal power plant right now. But if the real expectation is the high penetration of renewables can accommodate the power security in China in the future, especially after 2030, even with the retirement cliff, as you have said, that with those addition of energy storage or other options, or even more addition of the renewables, then then we don't need so much coal power plant at all. But there is the issues that whether or not the investors really have this expectation as modeler size. Most of the modeler believe, okay, there's no problem, okay, in 2030 with those technology option in hand, we can have a power system with a very low coal capacity, with high penetration of renewables that still can maintain the security. But if the local government in China, if those investors didn't believe this, they may continue their investment right now. So our scenario generally show those inconsistency may create a significant part of stranded assets in the future, especially after 2030. So how to make sure the investors' expectation is consistent with those modelers' expectation is something that we should consider.
Yeah, but I would think investors' judgments about this are going to change a lot also with time and more information and more demonstration year by year on the ability of the system to compensate for for variability and so forth. Anyway, we should move on to some other questions. There's some very good questions in the chat box, but I want the people to ask themselves. I want you to come on and ask it yourself. So Lily Chow, are you there? Do you want to ask your question?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Professor Tang, for this presentation. So I'm asking this question because we are also doing a model for Chinese new coal power projects. And I would like to ask if you know about what the debt to equity financing ratio that is currently faced by the new coal power plants in China. And what would you see that it would be evolved in the future under the climate neutrality 2060 goal? Thank you.
Generally, the debt ratio in China, I mean, for the coal power plant is generally 80%. 80% of those investments came from the debt, whether or not it's a loan from bank or it's other formation, but it's generally 80%.
Still pretty high for now.
Yeah. How it will evolve in the future and the climate neutrality, I have no idea about that, but I think that you may know a recent study by the Tsinghua University, the Professor Ma Jun, in terms of who is an expert in the green finance, and his study shows that the risk of non-performing of the coal power plant may increase in the future. from the 3% today to more than 24%, I think it's in year 2030. So if that is true, I think that may have implication on the financing structure of the coal power plant, because of definitely, if that is case, then the bank will ask a higher interest and also a lower share of the debt.
I see, it makes so much sense. Thank you.
There's also some very strong questions from Chen Gong. Are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, please ask your question directly.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Professor, for the talk. My question, so with the Corona crisis, Chinese banking industry is performing very large scale debt disposal on non-performing loans. Last year, a loan was 3 trillion RMB. According to your new study, it seems like the stranded capital is dwarfed by this number. So it does not impose disproportionately more financial risk than what is happening. So do you think it's maybe too pessimistic to think that early phase out is not possible because the write-off is relatively small? And on top of that, perhaps there are other reasons that policymakers do not want to undergo a fast coal phase out. First is that there could be like moral hazard of preventing other sectors to also ask for debt forgiveness, or there's just not fast enough built up of alternative power source or transmission grid. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, but I mean, regarding to the first question, I think that maybe my explanation is not quite clear. What I generally said is the previous study shows the stranded assets is about something 400 billion US dollars, which means generally about 3 trillion RMB. So that will be a huge number. But our estimates is much lower than that. Our estimates is just $60 billion. Then, as you have correctly pointed out, that will be 400 billion RMB. Then that will give more confidence for the policymakers in China to handle this. Otherwise, the previous study will generally threaten the Chinese policymakers to handle this, and that may delay the policymakers' action that to deal with this phase out of coal.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether I answered this question.
Yes, my second question was more about is there any other sort of real world related reasons for not a, how to say, immediate debt forgiveness, or in this decade something that's happening sooner? Is it to do with the scale up of renewables and transmission grid?
Yeah, I think there is also a very much, I mean, important incentive. So I didn't mention this very much in my talk. That is after the year 2015, there is a change of the approval process for the new investment in power plant in China. Before the 2015, that is central government to approve the new project. The central government has much more incentives that to avoid this overinvestment risk. But after 2015, the approval authority has been transferred from central government to local government, and local government has incentives to overestimate, approve more coal power plant in China, because firstly, that new investment will help them to grow their GDPs, and that is a very important performance indicators for the leaders in the local government. And secondly, the local government is very concerned about the energy security issues compared with others, because of if I mean there is a power shortage within their province, then that may suffer them from reducing the output of their industries, and they have the more incentives to overcapacity compared with the central government. So generally, that basically that explains why there is over investment, especially after 2015. And if we want to resolve this, we need to resolve this issues, this misincentive between the local government and the central government. I believe that is something we need to consider. And also the central government right now, they have a mechanism called a traffic light system. They generally give a traffic light evaluation for the risk in different province. A red light means the investment risk in those provinces will be much high. But that system doesn't consider this future risk imposed by the carbon neutrality. So to introduce the carbon neutrality and climate goals into that traffic light system will be another possible policy option to change the incentives.
Is Gang He available to ask your question? We're going to wrap up here soon.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Professor Teng. My question is related to your policy recommendation for extending lifetime of a coal power plants exchange for stopping building new power plants. That's very interesting and insightful. Then what are the carbon emission implications of extending lifetime of coal power plants? As some researchers studied that for existing power plants, they will always already need early retirement. So extending coal power plants lifetime, with that consistent with the carbon neutrality goal. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's also very great to see you, He Gang, here.
Thank you.
The extension of the coal lifetime will not generally will have not impact on the carbon emission, because as you have said correctly, that generally is just extended the lifetime of the coal, and its major effects is to avoid the new investment and to avoid the new addition of those stranded assets. But it will have no implication on the carbon emission. The carbon emission generally is not determined by this. I mean, is not affected by this policy to extend the power plant life. But I think that this policy will generally target to address these issues of the safety, this power supply security concern, and also as a solution that to avoid the stranded assets due to the new addition of the power plant in the future. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you. My research group also doing some work on the capacity expansion, which you mentioned you would like to have. Maybe we can discuss potential future collaborations.
Okay, great. I will follow this after this talk.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one last question, which looks like it's going to be a kind of a political question from David Jed Schwartz.
Yeah, you can hear me. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to push back on your. I had a couple of questions. Push back on your.
Just ask one, okay? Because we need to wrap this up.
All right, I'll just leave that aside then. But my question is that is the management of these coal-fired firms in the hands of either the CCP or the federal or government, or is it in the hands of the private sector such as it exists in China? As to say, in the United States, the question that you're posing in terms of oil, for example, is being handled differently by like ExxonMobil and British Petroleum. British Petroleum is electing to diversify its holdings because it wants to continue the lives of its managers and executives, and its capital, because so it's going to shift its capital into renewable enterprises. ExxonMobil is, as far as I have been able to ascertain in the last few months at least, is insisting that we want to stay in oil, and they run the danger of having their capital stranded and eventually reduced to nothing and ruined. But they're betting their bankrolls that the renewable, the push for renewables will be seen as a hoax, as Donald Trump would have had it. But their lives are not on the line. I mean, there's a story coming out of China in The Economist recently. A banking group was found to be in arrears by the CCP, and they shot the leader of the group. They just liquidated him. So that if the question is, capital is at stake, and it's not a matter of policy correctness or incorrectness, but it's a matter of capital and the value of capital, then it's a different frame of reference. And I question your assertion that if you stay in coal, it will have no impact on the carbon dioxide emissions ratio. I think that seems to me to be, with all due respect, a error. Thank you. And sorry if I have gone on too long.
Okay, I try to answer this shortly. Generally, before 2015, when the central government controlled approval of the new project, most of the decision is in the hand of the central government. The central government designed an investment plan. It designed how many of the coal power plants need to be invested in the next 5 years. And then the companies will compete each other that to get a new project approved by the government within this plan. So that is what happens before 2015. But after 2015, because of the approval authority has been transferred to local government, and generally the local government will not consider this from a national level, but generally the government lost the control on the investment in the coal power plant. That is why there is booming of the new power plant in after 2015. And then right now that the central government introduced this traffic light system, as I have discussed, this traffic light system brings some authority back to the central government, but not strong enough as previous happened. So there's a changing a story.
Okay, thank you. That was a good answer. I see there is one more question in the chat, which I want to, because it has to do with your redefinition of stranded capital. I want to ask Ryan Yao, or do you want to ask your question? This will be the last question.
Okay, I would like to ask my question. Can you hear?
Yeah.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. Because you mentioned that right now the debt equity ratio is about 80%, and if the company uses a stranded capital rather than stranded value, what will be this transition of policy has influence on the financing cost of the industry, state-owned industry companies, or even more the whole state-owned entrepreneurs? Thank you.
In fact, our policy recommendation is to use the stranded capital estimates for state-owned company and use the stranded value for private-owned company. And for the local government, it depends on the negotiation between the central government with local government on which concept should be used to estimate the loss of those values. And what is influence on the financing cost of the electricity industry? I think that will have influence on the coal-fired power plant. That definitely will incentivize the banks to consider the risk of the future loans to the coal-fired power plant, and that might increase the financial cost of those coal-fired plants, that may create another incentives to reduce the motivation or the incentives to invest in those coal-power plants in the future.
That's very generous of you to answer my questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you so much, Professor Teng, for staying up and doing this. This was excellent. This was a really good discussion. It was a very novel perspective on these issues, and we're looking forward to seeing your paper. And I want to thank everybody for participating. We've had a good run here with some of these online seminars, and we're going to be looking forward to doing it again in the fall semester. So let's give a hand for Professor Teng and wish him good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.